Hello, welcome to PLM Migration Planning 101 for Dassault 3DExperience. My name is Brian Scouten, Director of Technical Presales for ProStep Inc. And today I'm going to take you through planning, project definitions, resource needs, and some strategy around migrating data from your existing systems to 3DExperience. ProStep has been a long-term partner with Dassault Systems. Starting back with VPM v4 and CATIA v4 and v5, and then supporting all those Innovia products as well as modern 3DExperience. So we do a lot of migrations with 3DX as well as integrations with 3DX and CAA custom CATIA development as well. Something that makes ProStep unique is our wide variety of partnerships, and we're technology partners with a lot of major players within engineering and manufacturing. So that includes like Dassault Systems and Siemens, PTC, but then also like IBM for ALM, MSC, others, right? Aris, and maybe that's requirement systems, ERP systems, MES systems, other types of systems as well to really kind of bridge the different domains together and provide that type of interoperability. Technology partnerships include licensing for API, so that when you get one of these connectors from ProStep, a commercial off-the-shelf connector, we're supporting that, with the back end and getting releases of that product in order to test those connectors out and build new adapters for new versions and things like that. Also like to call out ProStep IVIP. This is our nonprofit sister company, and they lead standards within engineering data exchange and interoperability. So that's things like Step 242 and driving that through ISO as an organization, but also long-term archiving and retrieval. The LOTAR group over in Europe is led by the IVIP Association. So both those important in generating neutralized data and storing it for long-term archiving. And sometimes that can be used as a strategy in migration as well. Let's talk about aligning migration with the rest of your plan. And that might be a plan for a new introduction of PLM. It could be that you have a merger and acquisition or a combination of all of those. And you have to figure out how to align the data. Well, migration maybe is just part of that. And there might be a grand PLM implementation plan that has other functionality, other systems involved with. And typically that starts with an as-is analysis. And there's no migration as that component. But going into the to-be definition, you need to start thinking about what type of migration strategy you're going to use. And that could be maybe an ETL type strategy or a coexistence type strategy, how you're going to get the data in the system so the users can use it without disruption effectively. And then when you make a system selection, you might already know this, you need to start your migration planning with that. And so when you're understanding what the system looks like, what the data models are that are going to be involved, what functionality it has, you need to understand what data needs to be migrated in there in order to make that totally functional. And then when you're doing the implementation, do the validation and verification of the migration as well, and the implementation of the migration processes. And with the go live preparation, do the migration dry runs. That might be a wholly end-to-end load of data to ensure that the data is going to fit in there correctly and be functional and usable, within the system. And then finally, with go live, that's going to be the execution, or really the final stage of the execution of the migration. And that could be encompassing all the data or just the Delta update of just the latest data. But making sure that the data is there for day one of the go live. And important to this whole process is that migration is just a component, and it's a vital component to go live, but make sure it fits within that schedule. You can sometimes augment the schedule with maybe a sprint plan that has overlap between rollouts of functionality within your system, and then maybe 2 weeks later, the incorporation of that within the migration. So you can stagger the developments to make sure that migration is a core component to any of the new implementation going forward, and that will give you success in the end. So with migration, we start with requirements. And core to this is differentiating the requirements for decommissioning your legacy system and introducing your new system. And then maybe you can see what filters out, between that. A lot of times when we start these migration discussions, we come in and they say, I need every piece of data that's within the source system loaded into the new system. Well, that might not, be feasible, and quite frankly, it might not be necessary. There might be other ways that you can move that data, other systems you can put it into. Maybe it's just legacy data that you don't need anymore, or a format of that data, maybe one derived output is sufficient in order to accomplish what its goals are. So think about what needs to be extracted. Do you need all those versions, all the iterations? Maybe you just need the latest released, revision. Do you need all the history of the changes of each individual piece of data? And there's probably a nice balance there of, oh, I need, what each revision is, but maybe not all the intermediate changes. How do you handle other data types in the system that the data is coming from? So types that aren't readily transferable, like tasks that were accomplished within that system. That could be things like, sign-offs or, individual user tasks. Those aren't things that can then just be ported to the new system generally, because you have a different user there that has different timestamps and they just didn't do it in that system. So you can kind of roll those up, and there's strategies that you can use, like taking approval checklists, and you can go through and document on a change. Here was the workflow, and it has this approval history, and we can generate a PDF of what that change approval was, and then move that along with the change itself. So trying to document some of that workflow history. And then in a new PLM, what do you need in order to go live? And typically people are working on just new programs, so they're looking for the latest and greatest. That could be not just the release stuff, but the WIP stuff as well, the work in progress data. Could be that they only need the top 20 programs of data within the CAD, and they could maybe utilize the other CAD they might need for backup, but in order to actually use the system, focus on the most valuable data, and then maybe come back later and be able to pull through some of that other data. And you can pull through some of that other data through an alternative archiving strategy. That could be using LOTAR, long-term archiving, or another way to decommission the data without using the new PLM and adding complication there, especially if there's a significant amount of transformation or data cleanup that needs to go into it. One thing that normally is not approached within migration, but should be considered, is an alternative archiving strategy. Do you want to modernize all your CAD data and fix all of that, and then need to re-modernize that in another 20 years when you're going to this process again, and maybe don't have the hardware and software to support that? Or alternatively, if you need to keep the data around, you can transform it to like a step 242 format, and then use an offline repository that then enables that data to be used within a system in the future that doesn't need legacy hardware and software support, and doesn't then also need transformation into one proprietary format from another, right? So you don't need to keep all those CAD seats around, and if this is something that you're thinking of because you've got to keep this data for 50 plus years, then the archiving strategy should be incorporated into your migration. So you take over what you need in order to make your business move forward, but then also factor in archiving of that legacy data so that you can use it in the future, but it's more controlled and manageable. So there's multiple methodologies you can use for migration. The first one, and the one we generally use, especially for small and medium migrations, is the ETL style approach. And that's extract, transform, and load. That means you export all the data from the source system. You can then do any transformation of the data. That could be translation of the binaries or generating visualization. And then also mapping of the database data into the new target format. And then load, meaning import that data in all the data at once into the new PLM system. You can do that in multiple steps. Sometimes if there's a larger data set, we'll do what we call an initial load. That might take longer and do all the data maybe to a certain cutoff date. And then maybe load what the just the delta update in order to kind of complete that last months of data over a weekend so that it makes it easy for systems to go live. The other way we can do it is transactional, and this is more of a integration approach to migration. And what you do is define packages of data. Now that package could be like a whole division's worth of data or a whole program's worth of data, and then move just packages at a time over. Now, the disadvantage to this is that sometimes you need to synchronize changes and migrate the ownership of data between systems and go both ways because there's still data and there's still users within both systems. Now, the advantage to this, and this is a big upside, is that you can slowly move your users over to the new system and you don't have to move all the users at once and cut it off. Now, so there's more work to do here. There's more transactions, there's more data quality checks, but you can slowly incorporate and adopt that new system and not have total shock and maybe issues with that shock of adoption that you might have. And so transactional is a good approach if you're trying to take very large migration projects on. Especially for multiple systems and source systems. So what are the first steps in a migration? If you called us tomorrow, what process would we go through? And that's on this slide here. So if you called us, we would ask a little bit about the overall scope of the migration, what the source systems are, what data's in there, what type of conversion you might need to make. And then from there, we would develop a questionnaire that we would then send over to you, and then you would identify that. Volumes of data, types of data, versions of systems, versions of databases, how many users, where they are, if there's replication volumes, all that kind of stuff, right? And then we would use that questionnaire and go back and forth and then kind of fill in some of the details to get a good handle on the scope of data, meaning what types are there, and then also the volume of data, like the file counts and business object counts that are within the systems. So with that, then we can develop a really good process and proposal of how to do the migration. That migration then goes into a discovery workshop, where we can then really look at the data and then also evaluate what the mapping, business processes and constraints around that would look like. And then from there, formulate specifications for mapping and process strategy for the migration, as well as a timeline and all the user stories that might need to go into development within the migration kickoff. So in general, this is where we start with migrations. ProStep typically follows this type of migration process model in work packages. And that starts with the specification that came from that questionnaire and workshop. And then, includes a mapping document and a process specification. We might also do data evaluation and process and performance testing. Depending on what the needs are, we can test specific CAD translation tools or processes that might go in there, cleanliness of the data, and do evaluations on cleanliness. Then after that, we figure out what we think is the right process. Then we go ahead and design and build that, and install the tools, and then develop the scripts, and develop the tests for those as well. Execute the system integration and batch tests. And after the batch tests, we should be fully confident that we can execute 100% migration rehearsal. So then we go into what we call a rehearsal cycle. So after the batch tests, our developers are confident in the process, but the rehearsal cycle is testing both the process and the data. So we will execute normally between 2 and 4 full data migration rehearsals. And you go through every piece of data, you execute the data through the migration engine. And then if there's any discrepancies or any issues with it, then you can identify it during the rehearsal. So, the first one, maybe we'll do a limited set of data, maybe not 100%. Second one, do 100% of the data, and normally 98% of it goes through. But by the third or fourth one, we should see near 100% data, and then can do little, remediations, maybe a little data cleanup here or there. Fix those little edge cases in the migration and make sure that it's perfect. After the rehearsals are done, then we go through and execute and run the production migration, generate all the reports for it, make sure that all the data is correct, and you can go live in your new system. During the execution of a migration process, and this could be ETL, but also transactional, typically there's 4 phases. The first one being that we're going to let everybody know that we're moving the data, make sure you've got it all saved in the system, and this is all scheduled and prepared, and make sure the infrastructure is there. In the pre-migration phase, we validate the infrastructure, we do kind of smoke testing on the process tools, ensure that all the preparation is done. Sometimes there's accounts that need to be made read-only in systems, closing out tasks, things like that. And it depends on the system what the needs are. And then in the migration phase, we perform the data migration, so execute those scripts. And then from the execution of that, we're generating all sorts of KPIs and logs and issues. And then finally, we can compile all those and then, go live in the post-migration. If there is a significant amount of issues, we always have a plan to fall back and then, revert to the initial state, just in case. But 99% of the time that doesn't happen. We move forward, and then there's probably going to be a few issues here and there that we can then correct, and we know what those are. So move forward with what those are. And so in a ETL style approach, this might be a large volume of data, and transactional approach, this might be a smaller set of users that are going through, but largely kind of a similar process in either. So this is an example migration plan for a larger migration project. Migrations do span different amounts of time based on the volume and the complexity of the project, and some are just a couple months and some are many years. So depending on the scale, it might be different. And there are ways to compress that, and there are ways that we can make it easier on business by pushing it out longer as well. But in this one, it's an ETL style migration. You see at the top, there's a definition phase that includes the specification and the infrastructure setup. So we get all the servers together for test systems, as well as where we're going to script and export and import connectors and things like that. We then go through and implement, in this case, in an agile approach, but we could do this in a waterfall style approach as well, and do the development of the scripts. Do the testing, the system integration testing, and then the rehearsals, and do kind of minor, solution adjustments through the rehearsals, and really check every individual piece of data to make sure that those are being processed effectively. With that, testing being done, we'll execute the final migration. and move on. And you see that the infrastructure at the bottom kind of validates that sometimes you can get away with just a single migration server. But in other cases, you might want to have multiple environments in order to run like migration rehearsals and development at the same time, especially if you've got some overlapping functionality or there's different source systems and you're kind of moving from one source to another in order to get different migration efforts out the door. So there is some validity to having multiple environments for infrastructure. And generally we'll move the test infrastructure and point it to the production in order to execute a production migration. So normally only one or two, especially in a smaller project. In larger projects, sometimes more infrastructure is needed though. Let's talk about budgeting and resource planning that are drivers for your migration. Three major topics are time, people, and systems that are involved. On the time side, big drivers there are data complexity, data volume, and data quality. On the complexity side, this is the types of data that you need to migrate. So the complexity in the mapping, how many modules of different types of data or formats of CAD, how many changes you might make within the data models as you're going through and doing your migration that might need updates to those processes. And that might lead to more development overall for export, mapping, script, and translation processes, things like that. Data volume is also a big driver. So the more volume you have, the longer the execution time is. And that's not just for the production migration, but also throughout the rehearsals. So if you're running 2, 3, or 4 rehearsals, then you're going to see the full time it takes in order to execute all that data throughout those. Volume might also mean that you need a different strategy approach to the migration, like a initial load and a delta update for an ETL, or even a transactional kind of coexistence migration. And that might lead to more script development as part of a consideration for data volume as well. And then data quality, and this is issues that might require cleanup during the migration testing, might identify that there's release data that needs to be cleaned up, and then we have to go back to engineering to make sure that that's processed correctly. Generally, you don't want migration people changing production data. The people involved. So most important is migration leadership. Migration is not an exciting endeavor overall. So leadership is super important to make sure that it stays on time, that it gets delivered appropriately, that resources who are involved stay engaged throughout. The migration technical development team is very important in this. And these are the people that build the scripts. They have to understand both the source and target data models, understand the processes that are going to be involved within the migration, and be able to develop and test those processes. Also, the migration office business SMEs. These are then people that are going to gather requirements data, maybe from the different divisions. It could be that different divisions use systems in different ways and might need unique requirements for their migration, but then also can coordinate the data cleanup. So if there is data that doesn't process correctly, they can go back and work through the business in order to try and get that data cleaned up. We need SMEs that can decide the data model and mapping. And so there might be changes in the data model in order to accommodate different attributes that migration requires. And we need to determine the mapping for what those are. That people that understand the source system data. We also need migration acceptance testers. And then IT resources. So this is to make sure that all the systems within the migration environment are up to date and stay alive. And in some cases, they need to be refreshed with new data, things like that. On the system side, typically there's one or more migration servers. So you'll at least need one, and many times there's more. We use parallelization to scale to meet performance metrics. So especially in the case of like CAD data export and import, those are big performance hogs that sometimes need to be spread out amongst different machines in order to enable more parallelization to get the throughput you need to meet the migration goals. And so you might need, instead of just 1 or 2 servers, 3, 4, in order to be able to do that quickly. You need file storage space. So that's the total amount of file space that you're using within your source system. You need to make sure that that's available. Now, sometimes that's condensed a little bit depending on your requirements if you're moving, just the latest data or something like that. But you should calculate that out and make sure you've got adequate space for those files, but then also the database volume that you're going to be pulling out and storing there. If you're doing any translation servers, you need those servers. You need the process ironed out with the software that's used. So most times we want to use kind of the best available software for that. It doesn't always have to be from one vendor, and we'll find what that might be in order to use that within your migration. And you need licenses for the migration software. It could be for the migration software itself, could be for a translation, a third-party translator. Also licenses for named users for the systems that are involved. So not just admin accounts, but regular users, so we can test out data, look at data within the systems, before and after it's been imported, be able to open CAD up and make sure that it's correct, those types of things. We need test systems with data from production. So this is important, especially in the source system. We need the replication of both the database and the files and up to date as well within those systems to be kind of done at a regular interval. And then we also need that data to be able to be refreshed. So within both systems effectively. We'll start with all the data up to date within the source system, and in a migration rehearsal, we'll execute that, load all that data into the target, and then be able to refresh the target, meaning like you got to wipe that database, clear it out, and make sure it's ready to go again, and then load it again in the second and then the third rehearsal. So we need IT resources that are going to be able to help with those processes as well. Remember that ProStep's here to help. We've got hundreds of consultants, and we've been doing this for a long time. We've got specialized tools for migration, and we are interoperability experts, and we know all these different systems and how to move data between them. So give us a call or send us an email if you've got a migration project. We'd be happy to hear about it and maybe, at least shed a little bit more strategy or approach on how we would do it, or help you out in trying to get that. And with that, I thank you for attending the webinar. Again, I'm Brian Scouten. Feel free, send an email or give us a call, and we'd be happy to hear about your migration project.